The morning my parents knocked on the front door of my $12 million townhouse on the Upper East Side, I was drinking a cortado in my kitchen, wearing a silk robe that cost more than 3 months of their mortgage, and I already knew exactly why they had come. I'd been waiting 20 years for this knock. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened inside that house, before I tell you what I said and what I showed them and what I watched crumble in real time on my mother's face. I need you to understand who I was when they threw me out, so you understand completely who I was when they walked back in. Because the girl they tossed onto the curb of our split level in Naperville, Illinois, with a duffel bag and $60 in cash and a baby growing inside her body was not the woman who opened that door. I was 16 years old, 10 weeks pregnant, and my parents looked at me like I was a stain they needed to scrub out before anyone in the neighborhood noticed. My name is Bella Navarro. My father, Rodrigo, was a mid-level financial consultant who drove a leased Lexus and cared more about what the Delgado family down the street thought of him than whether his own daughter had a roof over her head. My mother, Carmela, was the kind of woman who volunteered at church bake sales and smiled at the priest every Sunday and came home and said things to her only child that I still hear sometimes when the house is quiet and my defenses are down. She told me I was an embarrassment. She told me I had ruined the family name. She told me, and I want you to hear this clearly, that whatever happened to me from that point on was my own fault, and she washed her hands of it. I was 16. She said that to a 16-year-old girl, and she meant every syllable. My father stood behind her with his arms crossed and his jaw tight and said nothing, which was somehow worse because his silence was its own kind of agreement. I called my best friend Naomi from a payphone 2 blocks away because my parents had taken my phone. They said it was their property, their plan, their rules. And Naomi's mom, a woman named Sandra who worked double shifts at a diner and had no business taking on anyone else's problems, said I could sleep on their couch. I slept on that couch for 4 months. Sandra fed me. She drove me to my prenatal appointments in her rusted Honda. She sat with me in the waiting room of the county health clinic and held my hand, and never once made me feel like a burden, which is something I have never forgotten and never will. I worked at a grocery store from month 5 of my pregnancy until 2 weeks before I delivered because Sandra needed help with rent, and I refused to be dead weight in anyone's home ever again. That was the decision that changed everything, by the way. That grocery store, that minimum wage register job. That is where everything in my story actually begins. Because the woman who rang up produce 3 nights a week was not just a broke, pregnant teenager. She was watching, she was learning, and she was building something nobody saw coming. My daughter's name is Soleil. I named her that because I wanted her name to mean something bright and warm and untouchable, the opposite of everything I felt the night she was born. She came into the world at 3:47 in the morning at Northwestern Memorial, with Sandra holding my left hand and a nurse named Patricia holding my right, and nobody else who shared my blood in the building. Soleil weighed 6 pounds 11 ounces. She had my cheekbones and her father's dark eyes, her father being a boy named Troy Figueroa, who was a junior when I was a sophomore and who, when I told him I was pregnant, said I can't be involved in this, and transferred schools the following semester. Fine, his loss, both of their losses, as it turned out. I got my GED at 17 while working part-time. I enrolled in community college at 18 because a counselor named Mr. Okonkwo told me I was smart enough to go somewhere real if I just kept moving. And I believed him because nobody else was saying it, so I had to find someone to believe. I took every business class offered. I took accounting, I took marketing, I took a real estate fundamentals course on the side because the woman who owned the building where Sandra rented had a leather briefcase and a calm confidence that I had never seen on a woman before. And I thought, I want that. Not the briefcase specifically, the calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly how much you're worth and not apologizing for it. Soleil was in daycare, subsidized, the kind where you fill out a form that asks your income in a box that doesn't have enough space for what you actually make, and I was in class by 7 every morning with a travel mug and a determination that honestly frightened some of my professors. I got my real estate license at 21. By 23, I had sold 11 properties. By 26, I was running my own boutique brokerage. By 30, I had a net worth that would have made my father's knees buckle. The townhouse on East 74th Street was my fifth personal property investment. I bought it at 32 after a deal I structured for a tech sector client landed me a commission so large that my accountant, a very composed man named Philip Steele, actually laughed when he saw the number and then apologized for laughing. I renovated it over 8 months, 12-foot ceilings, a kitchen designed by an architect I flew in from Copenhagen because I could, a wine cellar, a home gym, a library on the third floor with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a rolling ladder that Soleil, by then 14 and exactly as sharp-tongued and brilliant as I had raised her to be, said made her feel like she was living in a movie. She wasn't wrong. It was the kind of house that made people quiet when they walked in, the way you go quiet in a museum because beauty sometimes silences people before they know what's happening to them. I had built that, every inch of it. Nobody handed it to me, nobody co-signed anything for me, nobody gave me a leg up or a soft landing or a single dollar I didn't earn with my own hands and my own brain and my own sleepless nights. So when Rodrigo and Carmela Navarro showed up on a Tuesday morning in October with a carry-on bag between them and my mother in a dress she had clearly bought for the occasion, pressed and careful in a way that told me she expected to be welcomed, I felt something move through me that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction. It was something older and more precise. It was readiness. My housekeeper, a woman named Gloria, who has worked for me for 6 years and knows everything that happens in this house, had texted me the night before to say 2 people matching my description of my parents were parked outside in a rental car for over an hour before leaving. They'd come by the night before and lost their nerve. That detail told me everything I needed to know about the nature of this visit. They had rehearsed this. They were nervous. They needed something. And that changed the entire dynamic before the door even opened. There is nothing more dangerous in this world than a woman who has been underestimated by the exact people now standing on her doorstep asking for grace. I opened the door in that silk robe. I had thought about getting dressed, something professional, something that would hit them like a wall, and then I decided, no, I wanted them to see me comfortable. I wanted them to see me at ease in a house that cost more money than they would ever see in their combined lifetimes. Unbothered, unhurried, the way wealthy people are unbothered and unhurried because they have nothing to prove. My mother's eyes went to the foyer first, the marble floors, the statement chandelier, the original canvas above the console table, an abstract piece by an emerging Brooklyn artist that had tripled in value since I bought it. I watched her eyes move, and I watched the calculation happen, and I felt something click shut inside me, like a lock. "Bella," my mother said. Her voice was softer than I remembered. People get soft when they want something. "You look wonderful." I said nothing. I stepped back from the door, which was an invitation but not a warm one, and they came inside. My father looked older. His shoulders had the rounded quality of a man who had spent years carrying something heavy that never resolved. He looked around the foyer with an expression I can only describe as stunned grief, like someone who had expected to feel proud and instead felt the full weight of what they had forfeited. Good. They sat in my living room on the sofa I had imported from Milan, and my mother folded her hands in her lap and looked at me across the coffee table and said, "We heard about Soleil. We'd love to meet her. We'd love to meet our granddaughter." I remember the word granddaughter landing in the room like something dropped from a height, the audacity of it, the breezy ownership in the word ours, as if they had a claim, as if 20 years of silence and cruelty was just a gap in the calendar, something to schedule around. They called her their granddaughter, but here's the thing, they thought Soleil was a he. They thought they had a grandson. And why they thought that is the part of this story that changes everything. I had known for approximately 4 months that my parents were looking for me. My cousin Dina, who I had quietly stayed in contact with over the years, Dina was always the decent one, the one who slipped a 20 into a card she mailed to Sandra's address the Christmas after I left. Dina had called me in the spring to give me a heads up. She said Rodrigo had been diagnosed with a heart condition, and something about the diagnosis had cracked him open a little, made him start asking about me, asking about the baby. He had told the rest of the extended family that he had a grandson. Nobody corrected him. I don't know where the idea of a grandson came from, whether it was wishful thinking on his part, whether someone had mentioned Soleil without a pronoun and he filled in the blank the way men of his generation sometimes do, assuming. but he had been telling people for months that he had a grandson he'd never met, and now the heart thing had lit a fire under them, and here they were, sitting on my Italian sofa, hoping I would hand them back the family they had thrown in a dumpster 2 decades ago. The question you should be asking right now is, why did I let them in at all? Why not just send them away? Because I had been planning for this, that's why. Not in a dark, obsessive way. I am not a woman who has let hatred rot her from the inside. I have a therapist. I have a full life. I have Soleil and Gloria and Naomi, who now runs her own catering company in Chicago and remains my oldest friend. I have a business that employs 22 people. I am not a bitter woman, but I am a precise one. And when the people who abandon you come back looking for something, there is a version of justice that does not involve screaming or lawyers or a scene in a driveway. There is a version of justice that looks elegant, quiet, final. I had been building that version for 4 months since Dina's call. I had been waiting, and they had just walked right into it. They wanted to meet their grandson, and I was about to introduce them to something they were absolutely not prepared for. I offered them coffee. My mother looked relieved. The coffee felt like a thaw to her. I could see it. She started talking, carefully at first, about Naperville, about the neighborhood, about some renovation they'd done to the kitchen. Small talk designed to normalize the situation, to behave as though 20 years of silence could be paved over with kitchen renovation details. My father was quieter. He kept looking around the room. He looked at the framed photo on the bookshelf, Soleil at 16 in a white dress at her quinceañera, laughing at something off camera, gorgeous and alive and every inch her own person, and he stared at it for a long time. "Is that—" he started. "Yes," I said. I did not say anything else. I let him look. I let the looking do its work. My mother set down her cup and said, gently, the way you'd approach a skittish animal, "We know we weren't there, Bella. We know that, and we know we can't get that time back. But your father's health isn't good, and we want to know her. Him. The baby. We want to know the grandchild." I noticed the fumble. The him. She'd caught herself, corrected midstream. Interesting. She knew. She'd figured it out or been told, and she'd almost slipped, but the fumble was small and she moved past it, and I let her because I was not yet ready to show my hand. I told them Soleil was at school, which was true. She was at NYU studying architecture, full scholarship, no thanks to anyone in this room, and that she was aware they had reached out and that she had feelings about it that I was not going to override or manage for her. My mother nodded as if this were reasonable. She asked if she could perhaps write to Soleil, send a letter, something. I said I would pass along anything they wanted to send. My father finally spoke. He said, and his voice had aged, the confidence rubbed off it, "I think about you. I think about what we did. I was wrong." I want to tell you that those words broke me because that would be a human thing for them to do. They didn't. I had grieved that man a long time ago in Sandra's living room at 3 in the morning with a newborn on my chest. What I felt when he said it was not broken. What I felt was something very close to done. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what nobody in my family knew. The reason I had let them into my house that morning had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with what I had found out 3 weeks earlier about my father's. Revenge isn't a moment. It's a system. And I had been building mine with the same precision I used to build everything else. 3 weeks before my parents knocked on that door, I had been closing a deal on a commercial property in the financial district, a converted office building that a private equity group was offloading. And in the course of doing my due diligence on the buyer, a man named Victor Salas, my research assistant Priya had flagged something unusual in a subsidiary filing. The filing listed a silent investor in one of Victor's earlier real estate ventures, a residential development in the western suburbs of Chicago, circa 2009. The silent investor's name was Rodrigo E. Navarro, my father. My father, who, when I left home, had a leased Lexus and a mid-level consulting salary, and never, in any conversation I had ever had with him or heard him have with anyone else, mentioned real estate investment. My father had put $140,000 into a residential development in 2009, which was 1 year after I had left home at 16 with $60 and a duffel bag, and that development had returned him roughly 6 times his investment by 2014. I need you to understand what that means. That means that while I was sleeping on a couch and working a register and raising a baby alone on a budget that left no margin for error, my parents had money, substantial money, enough money that they could have helped me, could have taken me back, could have done any number of things differently, and they chose not to. They didn't throw me out because they were desperate. They threw me out because they were ashamed, and shame is a choice. That distinction lit something in me that no amount of therapy has ever fully cooled, and I want to be honest about that. But here's where it gets worse, because the development Rodrigo invested in was not just any project. It was a project I had personally brokered referrals into in 2012, before I knew any of this, through a contact network I was building in the Chicago market. Which meant, in a very real way, that my father had financially benefited from work that traced back to me. He had made money in my orbit without my knowledge, while pretending I didn't exist. Priya is one of the sharpest researchers I have ever employed, and when I asked her to go deeper, she went deep. What she found over the next 2 weeks was a thread that, once you started pulling it, did not stop. Rodrigo had not just made one investment, he had made several, all through intermediaries, all structured to stay off the obvious radar, all in the suburban Chicago corridor that I had helped develop professionally throughout my late 20s. He had, through a cousin of Victor Salas named Inicio, been passively invested in 3 projects that my brokerage had touched. Not directly, there was no line from his money to my commission, but close enough that when I laid it out on a spreadsheet and looked at it, what I saw was my father quietly getting rich in the neighborhood of my success while publicly pretending I didn't exist. He came to family functions, according to Dina, and told people he had built his retirement through smart investments. Smart investments. The audacity of that phrase in this context is something I have been sitting with for weeks. Now, let me tell you about the other thing Priya found, because this is the part that changes the shape of this story entirely. In 2016, Rodrigo had entered into a private loan agreement with Benicio Salas for a significant sum, $300,000, to fund a development in Evanston. That development had stalled, the market had shifted, the loan had not been repaid in full, and now, in the present, Victor Salas's company, the same company I was in the middle of a deal with, held a claim against Rodrigo through a chain of assignments and transfers that would take a forensic accountant to fully untangle, but that Priya, to her enormous credit, had untangled. My father owed money that was currently sitting inside a business structure I had professional leverage over. He didn't know that. He had no idea that the woman he had thrown out at 16 was now, by a series of events that were partly chance and partly the natural consequence of building a career in a specific industry in a specific geography, sitting in a position to affect whether that debt got called or restructured or quietly resolved. He came to my house looking for a grandchild. He had no idea he was walking into a room where the architecture of his financial exposure had been built in part by the daughter he abandoned. I want to be very clear about something. I did not intend for this to happen. I did not engineer this overlap. But when I saw it, I made a decision about what to do with it. And that decision is the whole point of this story. Soleil came home from NYU that Thursday. I had told her the basics. Her grandparents had reached out, they were in the city, they wanted to meet her. Soleil is 20 years old, and she has her mother's spine and her mother's mouth, and she looked at me across the kitchen island with those dark eyes and said, "Do you want me to meet them?" Not, "Do I want to meet them?" "Do you want me to?" That kid. I told her the truth. I told her it was her choice, and that whatever she decided I would support completely, and that I was not going to use her as a prop in something she didn't sign up for. She thought about it for about 45 seconds and said, "Let me meet them. I want to see who they are with my own eyes." I said, "Okay." I said we'd have dinner Friday. What I didn't tell her yet was the rest of it. The investments, the money, the debt. There was an order to how this needed to happen, and Soleil didn't need that wait before she'd even been in the same room as them. Friday dinner. I had Gloria cook because I was not about to perform domesticity for these people, and also because Gloria's arroz con pollo is the kind of thing that makes people emotional in ways they can't explain, which I thought was useful. My parents arrived at 7. My mother had changed her hair. My father was in a blazer. They were performing too. Everybody in that room was performing except Soleil, who walked in from the hallway in jeans and a NYU hoodie and her hair up, completely unbothered, and looked at them the way only a 20-year-old who has been raised to know her worth looks at strangers who expect to be received as family, which is to say, openly but not warmly. My mother actually gasped a little when she saw her, the beauty of her, the ease of her. My father stood up, and I watched something happen in his face that was complicated and private, and not my business to interpret, except that it looked like a man finally understanding the full cost of a decision made a long time ago. Soleil shook their hands. She didn't hug them. She said, "Nice to meet you," the way you say it to a client's assistant. And in that small, polite, devastating distance, she communicated 20 years of absence better than I ever could have with words. Dinner was civil. My mother tried hard. She asked Soleil about her studies with the attentiveness of someone who has been rehearsing questions. Soleil answered, thoughtfully, generously even. She is a more generous person than I am, which is both humbling and something I am absurdly proud of. My father ate slowly and listened. He said very little. At one point, Soleil asked him directly, the way young people ask direct questions because they haven't yet learned to be afraid of them, "Why didn't you try to find us sooner?" The table went quiet. My mother looked at her plate. My father put down his fork. He said, "Pride, stubbornness, fear of what you'd say." He paused. "All bad reasons." Soleil nodded. She said, "Yeah, they are." And then she picked up her fork and went back to eating, and the conversation moved on. And in that moment, I saw my daughter do something I had spent 20 years learning to do, which was accept an apology without letting it change the terms. After dinner, Soleil excused herself. She had a study group on Zoom, and I walked my parents to the living room for what I had been waiting 20-plus years to say. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to know that. I had thought about this conversation so many times over the years that the drama had been sanded out of it entirely, and what was left was something clean and precise. I sat across from them, and I said, "I need to tell you something about why I agreed to this visit." My mother's hands went to her lap again. My father's face went still. I told them calmly what Priya had found: the investments, the timeline, the returns, the proximity to my work. I laid it out the way I lay out a property analysis for a client, factual, sequential, without editorializing. My mother started to say something twice and stopped both times. My father sat very still through all of it with the expression of a man watching something inevitable arrive. And then I told him about the debt, the $300,000, the Solace connection, the fact that the deal currently on my desk was the mechanism through which that obligation could be called, restructured, or resolved. I watched his face change color. I watched him understand what room he was actually sitting in. "I'm not telling you this to threaten you," I said, and I meant that, which is important. "I'm telling you because you need to understand what actually happened. You threw me out to protect your reputation and your money, and then you quietly made more money in the ecosystem my career helped create, and now the financial exposure you've been carrying for a decade runs through a deal I'm brokering. That is not something I engineered. That is the consequence of a city being smaller than you thought and an industry that rewards people who show up and do the work." My father said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "What are you going to do?" I told him what I was going to do. I was going to close the deal because it was a good deal and it was my job. I was going to recommend to Victor Salas's legal team that the underlying debt be restructured on reasonable terms because I had no interest in destroying anyone financially, including him. And I was going to do that because I chose to, not because of anything he deserved, but because I had decided that my power in this situation was not going to be used the way their power had been used on me. I was not going to kick someone someone out into the cold just because I could. My mother started to cry. I don't say that with satisfaction. By that point, the satisfaction had been replaced by something quieter. She said, "I'm sorry, Bella. I am so sorry." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I know you are." And that was it. That was the whole of what I had for her, and it was honest, and I think on some level she understood that sorry and forgiven are not the same word, and that she had no right to expect both from me, and that I was giving her the one I had available, and that was enough. But I wasn't done, because the apology was for them. What came next was for me, and for Soleil, and for Sandra, who worked double shifts at a diner to feed a teenage girl she owed nothing to. 2 weeks after that dinner, I had my attorney finalize a document I had been preparing since before my parents ever knocked on my door. It was a trust, a charitable trust in the name of Sandra O'Coffer, who had retired the previous year from the food service industry with modest savings and a bad knee from 30 years on their feet. The trust was funded at an amount that would give her a comfortable income for the rest of her life, with a secondary beneficiary structure that went to a scholarship fund I had established for first-generation students at the community college where I had taken my first business classes. I named the scholarship the Soleil Navarro Future Builders Award because my daughter's name should be on something that outlasts all of us, and because the word future should belong to the people who were never given a head start. The announcement went out quietly. No press, no social media performance, no look-at-me energy. Just a letter to Sandra and a filing with the state and a message to the college's foundation director. Sandra called me when she received the letter. She cried. I cried. We were on the phone for 45 minutes and we laughed more than we cried, which is exactly right. My parents did not receive a trust. They did not receive a dramatic scene or a public shaming or any of the operatic revenge scenarios I had imagined in my 20s when I was still raw enough to want those things. What they received was a daughter who had built a life so complete and so structurally sound that their absence had not left a hole, it had left a blueprint. Every single thing I had ever done to survive them had made me harder and more capable and more clear-eyed about what actually matters, and the result of that was standing in a $12 million townhouse telling them the truth with no raised voice and no tears and no need for their validation. That is the revenge, not the money, the irrelevance, the fact that their approval, which had once felt like oxygen, had become the one thing in the room I genuinely did not need. They wanted to meet their grandson and found their daughter instead, a daughter who had become someone entirely beyond their understanding of who she was supposed to be. Soleil and I talked that Sunday morning over coffee. She'd started drinking cortados like me, which I find both annoying and deeply flattering. I told her everything I hadn't told her at dinner, the investments, the debt, the deal. She listened the way she listens, with her whole face, not flinching. When I finished, she was quiet for a second, and then she said, "So basically, Grandpa accidentally funded his own accountability arc." I laughed so hard I spilled my coffee. That kid right there is 20 years of right decisions condensed into one human being, and she is the entire point. She asked me if I thought they would stay in touch, her grandparents, going forward. I told her that was completely her call and that I would follow her lead on it. She said she thought she might be open to occasional contact, low-key, no expectations, treat it like getting to know a stranger because that is essentially what they are. I said that sounded healthy. She said, "I'm not doing it for them, I'm doing it for me. I want to look at them and feel nothing complicated, and the only way to get there is to let it play out." She is 20 years old. She is already wiser than I was at 35. I must have done something right. The deal with Victor Salas closed 6 weeks later. Clean, professional, exactly the terms I'd negotiated. The underlying debt was restructured on a schedule my father could manage, which I recommended because destroying him financially would have required me to care about him more than I do, and I have better places to put my energy. My brokerage landed the listing on 2 additional properties that came out of the same transaction network, which added substantially to our year-end revenue. Priya got a bonus that made her actually shriek on the phone, which was one of the better moments of my fourth quarter. Gloria made champagne chicken that Friday evening, and Soleil came home from campus, and we ate at the long kitchen table in that beautiful house that I built from $60 and a couch and a grocery store register and a determination that has never, not once in 20 years, let me sit down when there was still something left to build. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the people who hurt them to finally see them clearly. I stopped waiting for that a long time ago. I became impossible to ignore instead. That's not the same thing. That's better. My mother texts me occasionally now. Short things, a news article she thinks I'd find interesting, a photo of the garden in Naperville, once a recipe that I think was her way of saying something she didn't know how to say directly. I respond when I feel like it and don't when I don't, and that rhythm is one I set, not one I inherited. My father had a second cardiac event in February that required a stent, and I sent flowers to the hospital and a handwritten card because I am not a cruel woman, and because whatever I feel about what he did, I don't want him to die unwitnessed. Soleil called him from the waiting room while he was in surgery, which she told me about after the fact, and which made me press my hand flat against my sternum for a moment until my breathing steadied. She is so much better than the circumstances she was born into. I will never be done being grateful for that. There is a version of this story where I end up bitter, where the wounds my parents made when I was 16 calcify into something that poisons the good things. That version doesn't exist. I didn't let it. I chose very deliberately every single day for 20 years to take what they did to me and turn it into fuel instead of acid. Fuel builds things. Acid just eats through whatever it touches, including you. I built things. I built a company and a house and a life and a daughter who looks at the world like it belongs to her because I made sure she never had any reason to think otherwise. I built Sandra's security and a scholarship and a career that 22 people depend on. I built a version of myself that my 16-year-old self, sitting on that couch with nothing, would absolutely not recognize and would absolutely not be able to stop staring at. That girl deserved better than what she got, so I gave it to her myself. That's the whole story. That's all of it. The lesson is not complicated. The best thing you can do with abandonment is build something they'll have to walk past to find you, and then open the door anyway, on your own terms, in your own robe, in your own time, and let them see exactly what they lost. Take a moment to comment your city or country. I love connecting with you all. Thank you for listening and supporting, and be sure to subscribe for more stories. More are coming your way soon. Until next time, stay kind to yourself and stay strong.